Right, hello everyone. So today we are going to be looking at covalent bonding. So you're going to need a piece of paper, a pencil, potentially a compass and a rubber in order to kind of work through this PowerPoint, because we've got some tasks that I'm going to be asking you to do, and you're going to need to pause and do those tasks, and then we'll go through the answers as we're working through. So, covalent bonding. Covalent bonding is all about when non-metal atoms join together. So they can join together as two elements, so you could have two oxygen atoms joining together, or two hydrogen atoms, both of which are non-metals, or you could have two different elements joining together, like hydrogen and chlorine, or hydrogen and fluorine, and these of course are forming compounds at this point, but the bonds that are holding those compounds together, or those elements together, are covalent in their nature. So the point about covalent bonding is, of course, exactly the same as ionic bonding. Atoms are looking to gain a full outer shell. And the way that they do this with covalent bonding is a neat little trick, because they share electrons. So each atom will put electrons and share it with other atoms, and therefore through that process they end up with a full outer shell, which we're going to see in a second. Really important thing with covalent bonds is they're really strong, so they're really hard to break. They take a lot of energy in order to break them. And when we're looking at a covalent bond, one covalent bond is formed when two atoms each put in an electron, and so therefore we have a covalent bond formed at that point, single covalent bond. When we look at covalent molecules, so we begin to take a step back and we think about what these molecules can look like overall. They can be really small molecules like methane, which we can see here, or they can be really large molecules, which are really important to us, so things like polymers, so plastics we're thinking about there, or we could be thinking about proteins in biology, or DNA, or hydrocarbons. We could think about oil, really important ones. And then a special kind of group of molecules which we call giant molecules. And so these are quite similar to ionic molecules. Their structures kind of go on forever, and they're made up of thousands and thousands of molecules. And one of the most common ones here that you'd think about would be diamond, or we could also think about graphite as well. So one of the things that we just want to look at with this diagram is, here we can see that there is an electron from the hydrogen and an electron from the carbon, and they are sharing those electrons. And so what we can see is that we've got a covalent bond there. So in checking out our kind of molecule, remember we're looking for full outer shell, so they're going to resemble the noble gases, those group 0 or group 8 elements. So hydrogen needs 2 electrons in its outer shell to get a full outer shell, so 1, 2 for that hydrogen, and we can see it's 1, 2 for every single one of the hydrogens around here. So if we reverse that and look at it from the point of view of the carbon, then we can see that the carbon has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 electrons. So that's also got a full outer shell, and so we have 4 covalent bonds formed in this methane molecule. 1 covalent bond formed between each hydrogen and the carbon, so that every single atom within this molecule ends up with a full outer shell. And this would be an example of a small molecule as well. So first task, and you'll need to pause the video at this point, is I would like you to draw the electron shell diagram for a hydrogen atom, just as we kind of saw in the last slide, but we want it just by itself. Okay. Okay, so you should have something that looks like that. So we can see that we've got our outer shell for the hydrogen atom and its single electron present within that outer shell. Right, I'd like you to draw another electron shell diagram for another hydrogen atom right next to it. So we're going to end up with two of these next to one another. Okay, so here's our second hydrogen atom, and you can see here I've represented the electron here with a dot rather than a cross, so that we can see the two different electrons. Right, next one. I want you to draw the diagrams again, but this time I want you to draw it so that the hydrogen atoms are close to one another, and that actually those outer shells overlap, so that around about here we have an overlap between these two hydrogen atoms. Okay, so then I want you to put the electrons that we had into the overlap, so one dot and one cross, please. And that should give us a molecule, and remember this is a diatomic element, so we've got two atoms making up this element's molecule, and we can see here's the overlap, so this is where the covalent bond is being represented, and we have the electron from our first hydrogen atom and the electron from the second hydrogen atom here. And what that means is that we have our covalent bond formed. And if we want to think about this covalent bond, remember it's really, really strong. And from the point of view of this hydrogen atom on the left-hand side, we can see that it's got two electrons in its outer shell. And from this hydrogen atom on the right-hand side, we can see that it's got two electrons also in its outer shell. So it's a neat little trick for getting around this kind of full outer shell problem. So remember, covalent bond is one shared pair of electrons, as we can see here, and we could talk about this being a hydrogen molecule, which is of course H2, and over here we can see a representation of how we can show this molecule, which is its structural formula. So we're going to be doing that as we work through each time. Right, we're going to move through a series of examples now. This is going to be pretty exciting, so we're going to really apply this, and these are all the ones that you need to be able to do as part of your GCSE course. So you need to know these, you need to be able to construct these diagrams, and there's a couple of sneaky ones in there which are going to cause us a little bit of fun as we get through them. Right, so first off, I want you to draw the electron shell diagram for two chlorine atoms, please. So exactly the same as the hydrogen on the last side, I want you to draw two of them, please. Right, so that should look something like that. Now this is a bit more complicated. Remember, chlorine is in group 7, so 7 electrons in its outer shell, and we can see here that I've almost purposely left it so that these two electrons, we can see that's going to be where we're going to get our covalent bond being formed. So you know the drill now. Draw them again so that the outer shells of those chlorine atoms are overlapping. And put the electrons into the overlap from each of the atoms. And we should end up with something like this, and there we can see we've got our covalent bond formed again. There's a pair of electrons in there. We've got 8 electrons in the outer shell of each chlorine atom, so look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's a neat trick for getting that outer shell structure, which means again we've got a diatomic element. It's a chlorine molecule that we have here, which is Cl2, structural formula, Cl with that kind of dash in between Cl, and that dash is representing the bond. Right, let's get a little bit more exciting. Let's look at the compound. So hydrogen and chlorine, so we're going to be making hydrogen chloride at the end of this, or better known by its name that we use in the lab, which is hydrochloric acid when it's dissolved in water. So electron shell diagrams please for a hydrogen and chlorine. We've done these already, so it shouldn't be too long for you. So that should look something like that. On this slide I've managed to draw my electrons as different in my two atoms so we can see where that bond's going to form. You know the drill. Draw those two atoms so that outer shells overlap, please. With those electrons in that overlap as well. Which means that it should look something like this. And so we've got our covalent bond here. There's our shared pair of electrons. And the hydrogen has 2 electrons in its outer shell, so that's full because it's only got that first shell, which it holds a maximum of 2 electrons. And this chlorine, as we can see, has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 electrons in its outer shell. So therefore that's also got a full outer shell, which means we've got a hydrogen chloride molecule, HCl, structural formula H, and we have that bond Cl being shown there. Right, it's a bit more exciting. Let's try another one where we have 2 different elements joined together. So we're going to form another compound. One of our favourites here, the most common ones, 2 hydrogens and an oxygen atom, which means we're going to get dihydrogen monoxide, better known as water. So first off, the electron shell diagrams for 2 hydrogens and an oxygen atom. So you should get 3 diagrams at the end of this. So that should look something like this. And again, I've got my electrons represented as dots and crosses, so I can clearly see where my bond is going to be formed. Now, oxygen, remember, is group 6, so 6 electrons outer shell. So we've got these 2 lonely electrons, which are looking to form a pair. So, next part of the task. So draw it so that the shells of the hydrogen and the oxygen overlap. But this time we've got 2 overlaps that we're going to be drawing, which is a little bit more complicated. And it should look something like this. You may not have drawn it so it looks like the Mickey Mouse molecule as I've drawn it here, but this is the most accurate representation of it, to be fair. So here we can see Mickey's ears up here with the face down here. Now look, here's 1 covalent bond, here's our second covalent bond, 2 electrons in each of the hydrogens outer shells, so that's full. And now oxygen has gained the 2 electrons that it needs in order to gain a full outer shell, and so we've got 8 within this outer shell of this water molecule. So H2O compound, and here's the covalent bonds between the hydrogen and the oxygen atom represented in structural formulae. Okay, we're flying now. So let's add another atom into this and have a go at nitrogen and 3 hydrogens. What's it called, people? NH3? Of course, it's ammonia, isn't it? So draw out those 3 hydrogens and 1 nitrogen. Okay, there we go. So we've got nitrogen, which is in group 5, so therefore it's got the requirement for 3 electrons in order to complete its outer shell. Hence we have 3 hydrogen atoms forming here. So what we get to understand now is we'll begin to see why we get compounds that have particular formulae, because it's about getting that full outer shell with covalent molecules. So draw the shells overlapping for those 3 hydrogens with that nitrogen, and then put the electron in the overlap. Which means that you should have something looking like this. So look, we've got 1 hydrogen up here, covalent bond, 1 hydrogen here, covalent bond, 1 hydrogen here with its covalent bond. So each of those hydrogens, we can see it's got 2 electrons in its outer shell, so it's full. And this nitrogen, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, full outer shell. So ammonia, NH3, here's our structural formula for that substance. Now you need to be able to use different models in order to be able to represent what an ammonia molecule looks like. So we've got this dot and cross kind of structure up here. Here we've got this structural kind of formula and some other ones that you need to be able to look at as well. But we're not going to look at that in this video. Right, let's add on another atom, so carbon and 4 hydrogen atoms. So this is going back to something we looked at maybe a little bit earlier. Okay, so there's our carbon and our 4 hydrogens, and we can see carbon is in group 4, so 4 electrons in its outer shell, which means that it requires 4 in order to get full outer shell. So draw it so that they, the hydrogens and the carbons overlap all of their shells, please, and put the electron into the overlap for each of those atoms. Which means that we should have a molecule that looks like this. And yes, it's our old friend from the start of the video, which is methane. So we can see pair of electrons, pair of electrons, pair of electrons, pair of electrons. So we've got 4 covalent bonds formed here, 1 between each carbon and hydrogen, represented in this diagram down here by that straight line. And the carbon itself, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that's got a full outer shell. So this is methane, CH4. And here we can see the representation as a structural formulae. Right, let's make things a little bit more interesting. So 2 oxygen atoms. Now we've already drawn an oxygen, so we know what that looks like, but this is a more complicated one to solve when we do the overlap. Okay, so it should look something like that. So group 6. So we've got 6 electrons in each of the outer shells here, which means that they need 2 electrons each. So this oxygen needs 2 electrons, this oxygen needs 2 electrons in order to gain its full outer shell. How is it going to do that? Because we know that oxygen is O2. Well, draw the resulting molecule it forms. So overlap and see what you can do with electrons so that you end up with a full outer shell for each of those oxygen atoms. And remember, we know that oxygen is O2, so we have to be able to solve this problem. Right, so this is what it looks like, and if you got this solution, well done, because this is a real kind of leap forward. So what we can see is that each oxygen, so this oxygen here with the dot electrons, has put in 2 electrons into the overlap, as has this oxygen here, 2 cross electrons into the overlap, which means that we've got 4 electrons in the overlap. Now remember what we said, a pair of electrons is a covalent bond, so therefore 2 pairs of electrons equals 2 covalent bonds, or as we term it more correctly, a double covalent bond. So 2 covalent bonds means that they're held together really strongly. So this is a really stable molecule. It takes lots of energy in order to break this double covalent bond. So we're still a diatomic element that we've got because it's O2, but look how we represent the bond here. We have 2 lines, one for each covalent bond, one for each pair of electrons in this structural formulae. Right, so let's apply this for 2 nitrogen atoms. First job is to draw the electron shell diagrams for 2 nitrogen atoms first of all. So you should have something that looks a little bit like this, and note, first point is that we have our 5 electrons in the outer shell because nitrogen is in group 5. Now that means that each nitrogen atom needs to gain 3 electrons to get that magic 8 at the end. So take your atoms, draw them close together so that you get the overlap, and solve that problem. How does each atom gain 3 electrons from the other one? How are they going to share that to get that full outer shell? Right, if you've managed to do that, then it should look something like that. And if you've done this, really well done. It's a complicated one, so one of the most difficult ones that you could be asked. So we can see here that this nitrogen atom on the left hand side with 3 has put 3 electrons into the overlap, and this nitrogen atom here with the crosses on the right hand side has put 3 crosses, 3 electrons into that overlap. Now remember, 1 pair of electrons equals 1 covalent bond, so we've got 1, 2, 3 covalent bonds here, which we would call a triple covalent bond. Incredibly strong, incredibly hard to break, which is really important for us, and it means that nitrogen is incredibly unreactive, which also causes us some problems as well. So nitrogen molecule N2, and we can represent that triple bond with 3 lines in our structural formula between our 2 ends. Right, that brings us to the end of this covalent bonding section. So remember, you need to be able to talk about the fact that a covalent bond only occurs between nonmetals, that it is about sharing a pair of electrons, and that that can come in multiples. The resulting molecules, because of the strong covalent bonds that we get between them, have certain properties, but that's for a different lesson. Okay, thanks a lot, thanks for listening, and I hope you found this useful.